So then we start to look at support itself, and the interesting thing with kind of a SaaS model is that I guess support to some extent is actually baked into the service itself, because you can't get access to the software or to the solution unless that solution is available. And so as part of actually giving the right to use, there is effectively baked into it a bit of an availability commitment around this. But it's actually understanding what that availability commitment is. You know, how many people can have access? How are you expecting the solution to work? And that's what you need to have a conversation around in terms of the support side. There are two elements to the support. There is that kind of bug fix element, and then there is the actual kind of, just keeping this thing up to date, making sure it continues to work in the way that you thought it was going to work. And so we'll look at those slightly differently. In terms of the bug fix side of things and that element of it, there is a kind of a tendency that has developed about, from suppliers to almost commoditize the levels of support. So you can have, standard level support, you can have kind of silver level and gold level. And then from a customer perspective, it's about understanding how they're going to use the software, how the software is going to operate within their system, and therefore how much support they need. There's no point in paying for 24/7 if actually this is not business critical for you. If you can wait, if the system is not working quite right, then maybe look at that and look at whether a different level of support could be bought that's kind of going to work for you. And there's got to be an honest assessment about this, because obviously the more support you ask for, the more the supplier is going to have to provide, the more they're going to have to resource up in relation to it. And therefore, there is a cost that they're going to need to pass through to you. So make sure you're making that assessment right around what it is. It may be that this is, that this is kind of tax reporting software, and there's only a couple of times in a period that it needs to actually be up 24/7. The rest of the time, you've got a greater degree of control over, over what happens if it goes down. And so maybe there's a different way that you could approach it. But just because you could approach it in a different way doesn't mean that you're going to have that available to you, because as support becomes something that is commoditized, that may not be an offer. And so it's then looking at the different offers and working out whether one of them works best for you and which one's the right one for you. On the keeping up to date side, the thing there to really, and this comes back to a little bit that we've talked about already in terms of the implementation side, there are two elements to that. There is keeping up to date in terms of the environment that it operates in. If this is software that is designed to sit on top of, on top of Oracle software, say, then at that point you need to know that if Oracle continues to change, that this solution will keep changing with it. And that's one of the things that you want to kind of make sure that you keep an eye on as part of that kind of ongoing support. The other element, of course, is if this is software that is designed, as I was talking about before, to work on tax reporting, then as the regulations change, you're going to want to know that this solution changes as well, and it keeps up to date with those regulations. And so what are the commitments around that? So those are the things from a customer perspective that you're going to want to think about. How am I using it? Therefore, what kind of up do I need in relation to it? Can I actually, because this is configurable, can I actually do some of that support myself? From a up-to-date point of view, it's about what am I expecting this to do to keep up to date with this environment in terms of software technology and this environment in terms of the regulation that I'm operating within.
Yeah, and I think from a supplier perspective, that's an interesting question, and I'm only going to want to take any responsibility for that on the keeping up to date side of things if it's something that's built into my product or built into my service. So sure, if I'm selling you a tax compliance solution in your market, then absolutely I'm going to need to take some responsibility for that. If, however, I've got a whole bunch of customers using my solution in various different ways, and they just happen to be in high risk areas from a regulatory perspective, I absolutely don't want to be taking on the risk of regulatory change in all those circumstances. So again, that's a conversation that is often a tough one within the contract, and each party will have its own kind of views as to how that plays out. From a responsibility standpoint as a supplier, and from a sort of standard versus gold-plated model, I'm going to want to productize my service, my support as much as possible, particularly if I'm operating in a kind of large environment with lots of customers. The more that customers are asking me to do sort of specific support, the more costs that obviously I'm going to incur with that. And so again, what the other thing that we're seeing suppliers do actually is kind of offer almost like a train-the-trainer service, so that once you've configured the software, you can actually get your customers' tech teams involved in supporting it going forward, and that's quite a nice solution to some of these issues.
Yeah, and look, one of the other things to think about in relation to this is the potential for, not assuming that everything is going to be completely public cloud or private cloud, that there might be a community cloud, and so for some software, for example, kind of banking software, in the UK, it may be that the community as a whole kind of say, well, we need these requirements for our market, and therefore there is a kind of a commitment that sits, which is not bespoke to a bank, but to all banks that have to operate within that. And that may be kind of a hybrid between something that is specific to you and something that is basically, look, we'll do whatever we need to do in relation to all banks. So, there's all these kind of opportunities to explore this in terms of the way in which the solution and the service might be productized. So then we start to look at, what are the service levels? What is it that we're expecting? And that's something for the customer to take a step back from and kind of look at and look at what would happen if this business doesn't, what would happen to my business if this solution doesn't work, and how quickly would that happen? And that will then start to dictate what it is that you need to think about in terms of the service levels. And in some ways, the conversation about the support is probably as important, if not more important, than the warranty conversation, because nobody, well, not that I'm aware of, nobody goes into a contract with the expectation they're going to sue the counterparty in relation to it. That might be something that happens because something fails, catastrophically. But in most circumstances, the parties want to work out a way that they can work together and remedy kind of things that happen and continue to kind of have a viable relationship going forward. So the conversation around service levels is actually probably a more important one in terms of understanding what happens when things go wrong and how is it going to be managed. And that's about kind of pulling apart some of these commitments, say the availability commitment. If you've got something that is business critical and you're asking for it to be up 24/7, right throughout the year, then a 95% availability measured monthly becomes a bit of an issue, possibly, because 8 hours, and you're still sitting round about the 95%. You might be comfortable with that, provided that whole 8 hours doesn't happen at one time. And so it can be about kind of looking at what you actually need and then kind of unpicking that and going, well, how would that work if that all happened at once? How would that work, if I could spread that over a period of time, and have that conversation around the service levels. And again, it comes back to, I need this, and the customer is saying that this is what's critical to me to run my business. If I can't, then I've got a real problem. From the supplier perspective, when they're looking at the kind of the productized thing, they're going, well, these are my solutions. And so you just need to kind of have that conversation with the supplier about where you can get to.
Exactly, and some customers will require that, but I think if that more sort of targeted solution from a support and availability perspective, obviously as a supplier, the more customers who are asking for different solutions, the harder it is for me to deliver. So again, I'm trying to be as standardized as possible with the availability and support levels that I'm offering. Some things to think about, I guess, maintenance windows. So again, have that engineered as regularly and as standardized as possible, so that downtime, scheduled downtime for the software is happening at the same time across the board. Thinking about time zones, possibly where my support teams are based. If my customers are in a whole bunch of different time zones, how is that going to affect what clients in particular geographies are asking for from an SLA and even from an availability perspective. And then lots of SaaS solutions actually depend on a number of third-party vendors themselves, and particularly thinking about infrastructure hosting providers. The support that they provide needs to then be flowed down to the ultimate customer. And so as a supplier, I need to be very clear with my customers what is within my control and what is a service that I'm essentially just passing on to them in terms of support. I think on the warranties side, it's an interesting point. I think you're right, Simon. The support rather than the warranty can actually be the most important thing in a lot of these deals. And what we're seeing in the market is, despite the fact that SaaS is slightly different to kind of old school software licensing, warranties are still relatively short in length. So, I might get 30 days, or I might give 30 or 90 days from go live, and then actually you're relying on that support, because obviously that's baked into the business model. So I think, yeah, absolutely, that the support schedules are something that lawyers need to look at just as much, if not more, as the warranties in the front end of the contract.
Yeah, and look, another thing to think about with the kind of the support side is not just what's on the paper, but what's not on the paper, in terms of, if you kind of say, look, I need a 99%, a 95%, a 90%, what happens after 90%? What are the remedies after 90%? Because, if 89% and 10% are treated just the same, then you've got a bit of a problem. So one of the things to also think about in all of this is, what happens at each point and what happens after that. So those are really important things to kind of talk about. And unfortunately, that then leads to the next conversation, which is about